Thank you, Senator Reynolds. Senator Carr.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. This legislation has been introduced in a hail of publicity for the final 2 weeks of the sittings of this year, along with the ABCC legislation. We notice in the press today the government has sought to play up how significant these matters are, and I heard on Radio National today how busy we would be discussing these questions. And of course the reality is very simple. This is a government that has no substantive legislative agenda. This is a government that has essentially stumbled throughout this year, went to a double dissolution in June, has a truncated and somewhat stunted budgetary program prior to that, in a desperate bid to actually clean out the Senate from the ravages of the crossbench as they saw it, only to find that that double dissolution turned out to be very bad for the government. The government's now been reduced to with a majority of one. This is a Prime Minister that has come into office just over a year ago, full of hope and vigour, with great expectations of what he would achieve, only to find that those hopes and those expectations have been dashed as we realise that this is a Prime Minister that is captive of the extreme right wing of his party and now has very little to say about the future directions of the country unless it's actually approved by the extreme right wing of his party. And so we have this morning publicity around this bill and of course the others that the ABCC bill. Now, what we've noticed that this government in the last couple of weeks has become increasingly hysterical in the language that it's used. Because it lacks this legislative program of substance, it now has to resort to the good old sturdy standbys of Conservative government, that is racism, xenophobia with a touch of union bashing. That's what really is the hallmark of the government now, and this of course is very much part of that agenda. Nothing to say about jobs, nothing to say about the circumstances on which ordinary Australians find themselves in terms of the declining economic opportunities for most Australians, nothing to say about the fact that we've got the lowest participation rates in 30 years in terms of the labour market, that real wages have stalled in this country, that living standards are declining, nothing to say about the fact that we are shipping jobs offshore like it's going out of fashion, nothing to say about what the real circumstances of this country are, but a desperate attempt to frighten the living daylights out of people by mocking up these proposals to try to suggest that somehow or another this is a government that actually stands for something other than the extreme right-wing agenda that, of course, gave Mr Turnbull the keys to the lodge. That was the terms on which he secured the replacement of the Liberal Party leadership from Mr Abbott. And he could only act on those matters. So all the great issues that he, of course, had made his name in terms of producing a progressive Australia all goes out the window in the desperate exchange, the exchange that he has made with the right wing of the Liberal Party so that he can appear to be actually running the government. Now, of course, we've heard from Senator Reynolds just now on the classic sort of formulation of this proposition that the government advances, or they say, well, we really like unions. We really think unions are good. But of course, it's a vision of unionism very different from what most Australians see as the role of trade unions. There is a vision of trade unionism on the Liberal side, which is essentially sees trade unions performing a tame cat role, like some sort of voluntary association, like with all the other great interest groups of the country. But in terms of having the industrial capacity to defend the rights of workers on the job, well, of course, the unions are not really to be treated in that way under this government's mentality. What we see is, of course, that we don't have any talk about unions having a political role. That's regarded as illegitimate, because what unions are really about is some sort of voluntary organisation. We have a cup of tea and a bit of a chat every now and then. You don't actually do anything about preserving real wages. You don't do anything about ensuring occupation, health and safety. You don't do anything about defending working class life in this country. Because that's not the role of unions, and according to the Liberal Party, what the role of unions essentially is this legal fiction about the right to organise, but not the right to actually do anything. And what this bill is a further extension of that proposition. Now, we've heard a lot about the misdemeanours and the various malfeasance actions of an isolated group of trade union officials, many of whom this minister, of course, is coming to this chamber and waxed lyrically about when on matters are actually before the courts. Only too happy to use, abandon the sub judice principles and to blacken people's names, even those people that have been acquitted. We don't hear anything, acknowledgement that people actually are brought before the courts, nor do we ever hear anything about the facts that when people are acquitted of the crimes that she's accusing. And they are crimes, if they're proven, and that's the whole point. This is a bill that doesn't really take any interest in making better workplaces or ending union or corporate corruption. It's not about that. Of course, we make the point again and again and again, the Labor movement has no room for corruption, no tolerance for corruption, wherever it occurs. It doesn't matter if it's a union official or a company executive. We take the view that that, of course, is not the intent of this bill in any event. That's the ruse, that's the device to use to, of course, establish a further step forward in a union-busting, anti-worker agenda, as coalition governments have done for generation after generation. There's a standard pattern here: establish a Royal Commission, make all sorts of sensational allegations, and then the reality is, take coal for instance, how many people were actually convicted of any offence? Despite all the claims. Despite all the claims. What we see, of course, is this measure is to establish a Registered Organisations Commission, headed, of course, by a Liberal Party appointment. The new commission would have even greater powers than those that are available as the General Manager of the Fair Work Commission. This is a bill that actually seeks to advance the anti-worker agenda of this government, of seeking to criminalise legitimate trade union activity. It's not about dealing with criminal offences, because these proposals here, in themselves, don't acknowledge that there are currently laws against criminal activity. What we have here is, in fact, measures that are pertaining for penalties, which are, of course, much higher for civil contraventions. As I say, it's about criminalising normal activity. These sanctions are essentially onerous, they're unfair. What we have here, and of course we see the circulation of the government speaking notes, not just amongst the government senators. I've heard Senator McDonald and, of course, Senator Robinson now, because it's clear that the government speaking notes are now being distributed to One Nation. It's very clear, because they use exactly the same rhetoric, exactly the same examples, exactly the same circumstances. What we have here is a simple proposition that the Registered Organisations, and this is the government never acknowledges this, the Registered Organisation Act already prohibits members' money being misused in favour of particular candidates, for instance, in internal elections. Because the current laws in this country allow for criminal charges to be laid where funds are stolen or obtained by fraud. Already, legislation in this country allows for the Fair Work Commission to share information with police where that's appropriate. Already provides statutory penalties where orders of the Fair Work Commission or the federal court are knowingly or recklessly contravened. And we already have laws in terms of registered organisations about fiduciary duty akin to those of directors of the corporation law. That already exists, that law. The current Act already requires officers to disclose their personal interest. Now, we acknowledge there are always needs to improve, but you have to actually acknowledge what the law is at the moment, and that is seeking to improve. And that's why we're proposing a whole series of amendments, including limitations on donations to make it consistent with the Electoral Act, and we have a contingent notice of motion provided for both a series of amendments that we'll propose in that regard. We won't support this bill, however, unless there are proper amendments. And of course we acknowledge this is a bill that really isn't about genuine reform. It's about a political agenda, A political agenda by this government, desperate, trying to cover up the fact that it has no broad agenda. And now, of course, we have One Nation. One Nation which has, of course, claimed that it came to this place as the enemy of the elites. But we now demonstrated just how deeply anti-Labor and anti-worker One Nation is. It masquerades around as a hostility of its hostility to the elites, but has in fact become the tool of the elites. One Nation appeals to freedom of rule of law. Of course, all of that rhetoric is shallow and empty and demonstrated to be such, because One Nation is in fact acting as a cat's paw for the Liberal Party in its anti-worker, anti-union agenda. One Nation is, of course, about busting open the Labor movement, who are the only bastions in this country to defend ordinary people against what are the abuses of corporate power, the abuses of the extraordinary capacity of the corporations in this country to actually take advantage of the current law. These are the circumstances that need to be assessed when we're looking at these agendas, because what we now have here is a party that has brought us in the party of work choices, having yet again entered into this array of measures, and they've made it very clear in terms of their other legislative agenda. They've made it very clear in the way in which they've conducted themselves in this parliament. We've seen the Royal Commissions established, as the historic pattern has shown. We've seen the deeply partisan actions of the government's so-appointed Commissioner, Mr Dyson Heydon. And of course we know that the whole attempt was to stigmatise the Labor movement, stigmatise leading members of the Labor movement, and to seek electoral advantage in so doing. But of course the government was somewhat embarrassed by these measures and chose not to actually mention too much in terms of the last election. The reason for the election was not discussed, and that's very simple, a simple proposition here, because they know that within the trade union movement there is very deep hostility to this, but even more important to this is that the Australian people understand how significant the trade union movement is to the history of this country and to the future of this country, ensuring protections of ordinary people's rights. Now, this is a government that spent $60 million on its tainted Royal Commission, and what we know is it was about hounding Labor leaders, it was about hounding trade union officials, and a transparent political agenda, which of course was not a surprise to anybody. But of course we know that the Australian people are awake up to these measures, and they, just as they were when the government, when it was in government under the Howard time, when it was in regard to work choices and their so-called Australian workplace agreements. Now, in 2005, the Liberals sought to pretend that workers' pay and conditions were protected by law. They in fact said at that time the wages and work conditions were actually too high. And then they said, of course, this various measures that they were introduced to freeze wages, to affect the consequence of their policies by reducing living standards, of cutting wages, was of course part of a much more detailed program of union busting. Now, we know that the public are awake up to this. We saw, for instance, in the submissions to the various inquiries into this bill, and that's why this bill's been knocked back several times in this chamber. Quite clear that both union and the union movement, and also amongst employers, is an understanding of how dangerous these measures are when they are used by a hostile government that wants to undermine the capacity of workers to be able to organise and defend themselves. Now, it's not just a question of the intransigence of the chamber, it's because of the fact that the government itself understands deeply why it needs to actually accept a whole series of amendments to this measure, because this bill is deeply flawed. If this bill was genuinely about reform, it would acknowledge what, of course, is happening within the AFP, within the police services across this country, about their capacity to actually investigate crimes. It would acknowledge that the Australian Crime Commission has coercive powers, already has coercive powers to investigate crime. Now, these are the appropriate agencies to deal with criminal matters. They're not industrial relations bodies. It should be left up to the people that are actually responsible for dealing with criminal matters, and not left to try to criminalise trade union activity. Now, what the Shadow Minister and the member for Gordon has foreshadowed on behalf of the Labor Party is a whole series of amendments which are designed to actually provide for stronger penalties but which would exempt volunteers. And I heard before Senator Reynolds say, well, of course, we can't have ASIC regulate registered organisations. Now, does that not give the lie to the proposition that there should be equality of treatment between company directors and trade union officials? Get the same body to do it? But what we're hearing today is, oh no, we can't possibly do that because we need a specialised political police to be able to organise union-busting activities. Now, what we've also said, though, that given the importance of the electoral changes in this country and about ensuring proper accountability to democratic principles, that the same question about disclosure in regard to electoral donations should be made through, whether it be by companies, whether it be by the banks. I'd dearly love to see the detail of the way in which the banks operate and how they influence the political direction of this country. I'd dearly like to see the operations of companies in regard to, for instance, for the situation we saw with the recent scandals on the various franchise chain stores in this country. I'd dearly like to see the level of political engagement that they've had. I'd dearly also like to see that the Australian Securities and Investment Commission should have the power to investigate serious contraventions of the Act, which of course you would have thought if the government was serious about equality of treatment before the law, they would accept these amendments. Now, what we're sort of talking about in terms of misconduct, we would expect the government to engage properly with the opposition on these matters, rather than seeking a blatantly political attack on unions, as we've heard today, as we've heard again and again, as this government desperately tries to cover up the fact they've got very little to say about the future directions of this country. Now, we are saying that we shouldn't have different standards for workers and employers. We acknowledge that, and that's why our amendments go to that question. What happened in 2012 is the present Leader of the Opposition, as Minister for Employment, introduced reforms to the various laws regulating registered organisations. Now, those changes actually acknowledged that their penalties could be tripled for breaches of the Fair Work Registered Organisation. The legislation required education and training and responsibilities of governance be provided to officials of registered organisations, both employers and unions. It enhanced the investigative powers available to Fair Work Australia, including giving the General Manager of Fair Work the power to share information with federal and state police. And the reform corrected a serious flaw in the regulatory regime introduced by the former Minister for Industrial Relations, and that was, of course, Mr Tony Abbott. That the rhetoric and the misinformation peddled by the government never acknowledges that this is the history on these matters, and that there are, of course, quite strong provisions within the current regulatory arrangements. If the government was to be honest about this arrangement, it would acknowledge that its real agenda is about destroying the union movement. And it's about trying to destroy the links between the trade union movement and the Labor Party. We are proud of our relationship with the unions in this country, and unlike the Liberals, we actually acknowledge the critical role that unions play in defence of working people and the important role they play in the advancement of a progressive and a fair economy. Now, unions have driven fundamental social and economic reform in this country. They've let every benefit, of course, has flowed through the people of this country. The 8-hour day, annual leave, sick leave, the weekend, penalty rates, workplace safety laws, equal pay for women, Medicare, superannuation. Now, how many of these measures were actually supported by the parties of town and country capital in this country? Not one of them. Not one of these social justice measures were ever supported by a conservative political party in this country. We've got to acknowledge there's some simple basic principles at stake here. The principles of a fair Australia, a just Australia, Australia in which everybody has the right to has rights which can be defended whether it be in the workplace or whether it be at the ballot box. And what this bill does is seeks to undermine that fundamental industrial and political principle.